Welcome everybody. We're going to be moving on to the provider user stories today. So that is really excellent to be moving to that part. So I looked back over the provider stories and they're not as detailed as the others, but I feel like they really capture what a provider is going for in a general way. So we can decide as a group, maybe we want to add in some more details, but I thought we would start by going through it at this sort of more high level perspective. So the first one is, as a provider, I want my data to be used. Is that a reasonable statement? Anyone want to? All right, so not hearing anything.
That sounds good to me, yeah.
Excellent. So the next one is, as a provider, I want my data to be used accurately.
What do we mean by accurately?
That's a good question. So I can tell you that where that sort of springs from is we added extended context to the way that we provide information to users so that they can make the best choice possible. So if there's two results that both have the name Will Smith, but we include in extra information like this Will Smith is a musician and this Will Smith is an actor, that provides enough information that the user can pick the right Will Smith. So that's kind of what I mean by accuracy, but perhaps we need more words there to convey that.
Because when I was reading that, another thing that came to my mind was using the API in the way we have intended it, or using the right API for the task. Because at least for Wikidata, we have several things that you could consider API, and some people use the wrong API for the job that they are trying to do, and it's taxing on our infrastructure.
Yeah, that seems like a separate one. So I put that the line below. As a provider, I want users to be able to identify and use the right API for the task they are trying to perform. And I put an example on the one that says accurately to give the example that make an accurate selection from the information in the search results.
That sounds good. Thanks.
And Lynette, can I ask if in these two user stories, you have in mind also the case where someone uses my data massively, for example, and this can produce some miscorrect usage of my server or something like this. I have in mind some specific cases where we go to search and other sources and the providers say us, okay, please don't use in this way my data. You need to do something. I don't know if you have in mind also this kind of a technical accurately situation.
So can I ask a clarifying question here? That sounds like you're talking about like having the rights to the data and that you want to provide. Maybe you could say a little bit more because I'm just not completely sure where that fits in.
Yes, I give you the exact example. When we started to use, for example, VF as a source, an external source, we used, usually we use the VF with a lot of different query. So the server was called in a very hard way. So people from VF asked us, so please stop to use in this way my server. You can use another way for massive data. For example, downloading my data one time and using them. So is this case, I want my data to be used accurately, also include this kind of situation where a source is not correctly used from a technological viewpoint?
So would it be, I want users to connect to my server in a way that is efficient?
Yes, and not, yes, and without creating crashes or mm, noises. I don't know how.
Excessive
So,
bandwidth,
yeah,
maybe?
yes, exactly.
Excellent.
Can I
So,
comment on this?
sure.
This is Hetty here. We noticed that sometimes, especially automated processes that use our API, have a tendency to overload our system. Would be better in this place that as a provider, you have mechanisms in place that try to avoid this overload, rather than having to go to the individual user of your system and telling them stop doing what you're doing, because basically you allow them to do that. And so it doesn't seem wrong or inaccurate for a user to use the system as they are, and maybe a good way to stop this type of searching is I don't know, timeouts or restrictions on the number of replies that you can get, or the number of the timeout for a certain request that's being done. From a perspective of the provider, I don't feel very secure in that I want my data to be used accurately. I want to provide as much information for the user of my data to be able to use it accurately, but I don't know what accurate is, and I just want to give as much information as is possible for a user to use it accurately. It's not the provider's task.
Yeah. In fact, I think that is exactly the topic of how many information as a provider I'm able to give to other people, because in some cases it is exactly a lacking of information that produces some not accurately result or usage.
Exactly, yeah, yeah.
I would agree with that, but for Wikidata, we also have the opposite problem where people complain that we're sending them too much. So maybe we need to talk about a sweet spot there.
Okay, so to capture that, I shifted that one to be, I want to provide enough data to facilitate accurate selection by the end user without providing an overwhelming quantity of data.
That works.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know
I
exactly how far we got with the user stories for searching, but it sounds reasonable to me that you would maybe have multiple levels of information that is sent back as a response by the provider. And one might be a list containing only some generic data, but it can be a large list. And the second might be something which is very elaborate and very specific, overwhelming quantity of data, but only for one or two records maybe, and something in between maybe. So the user determines how specific, how the quality and the quantity of the data, how much it can be.
So does this capture that? As a provider, I want to allow the user to control the quantity of data returned, and then I give the examples: simple list, extended context, all available.
Sounds good.
So I'd like to jump back to the one, this one on throttling. So as a provider, I want to put in place restrictions where an example would be throttling, timeouts, perhaps other things that prevent automated connections from overloading our services. Does that capture that one for you?
I think so, yes. You need something like that to avoid this case where VIAF connects to a user, to discourage the load on the system. Yes,
should it maybe say I want to be able to put in place restrictions?
Yes.
Probably, yes.
Yes, I agree.
All right. Excellent.
Of course, together with this goes an obligation to the provider to give information why the restriction took place when an overload is reached.
Does that fit for you? As a provider, I want users to understand why restrictions were put in place when an overload is reached.
Yeah.
Well, probably if to understand, you mean that they get explicit information about it in their response.
Maybe something like, as a provider, I want to be able to communicate to the users why they're
It sounds more,
being restricted or something.
More appropriate, yes.
So I want to be able to communicate to users why restrictions were put in place when an overload is reached. And I give the example of receive explicit information in the response. In the response to their query. How is that?
Sounds good.
Sounds good, yeah. Definitely not, probably not mandatory, but nice to have.
Yes, so along those lines, we will definitely be doing a survey that allows folks to sort of prioritize what is most important to them. We'll be able to get at that information of whether or not we think it's required versus nice I think once we get these all defined. For anyone who hasn't been to the last couple of meetings, we do have a survey that's put together now for the cataloger user stories. And I'm going to be putting together the developer ones as well very soon. It has to go through our IRB process at our university, so I won't be able to send it out until that process is complete. I'm hoping it's not going to take more than a week, probably 2 at the absolute max. So hopefully that'll be approved soon and I'll be able to send those out. And it shouldn't go as slow when we do the provider one, just because the other 2 will have already gone through at that point. So it should be a much quicker process. Any other discussion about these ones that are at the top that have been added today or that were already in there?
Probably in terms of information is also useful to have all possible information about update of sources. So I don't know if we can include within the general needed to stay updated or to stay informed.
Does that get to it, Tatiana? I want to document the source of data in our system.
Not the sources, but the updates, how and when the updates are realized.
Okay, that is definitely coming. So I'll hold off on that one. Before I take this one out, is this a provider user story that you want to be able to document where the data is coming from that's in your system?
Yes, probably yes. In our situation, yes, this could be interesting. Also, to document the source of data. Yes.
But is that a requirement for the search API? It seems more like a requirement for the system behind it.
So I do know that some of the user stories that have come out, like under the developers, we're asking for like information about the API and information about the data, because it allows people to know how they're going to interact with the search system if they understand where the data is coming from. I mean, someone else can join in and comment on that as well, but that's my understanding.
So how do you visualize that? Because this sounds like metadata of the entire ontology. So should you send this documentation for each request, or is it some general request that you can make about the sources of the data that's provided?
So I will say that in previous discussions under the developer section, there wasn't a request that the documentation come as part of the search results, but be documentation that's, you know, on a website or something that you can go and look at it to understand. So this isn't necessarily through the API itself.
Okay.
Lynette, do you think that at the end of this whole work, we can try to do a sort of mapping between user stories from providers, from developers, and from user perspective to be sure that the requirements are enough satisfied by the 3 parties or not? Because when I am a provider, I have some exigencies, but I'm in the meantime a developer. So asking data from another provider. So probably at the end, we can try to map if these requirements from a provider viewpoint has a related requirements in the section of developers and in the section of users or not?
Yeah, I think that is a good idea. I think that's the next step is really going to be about how do we turn these user stories into requirements, and understanding how they fit at each of the levels, I think is going to influence what,
okay.
And I don't even not necessarily want to say requirements, it's more of like a proposed specification. So these are the things that you can put into practice that will make for a good API.
Okay.
All right, so the next one, as a provider, I want to support the creation of application widgets that provide access to our data.
Important, yes.
I think I'm going to add on here.
I feel a bit at a loss here because we don't, at ISNI, we don't really aim at any APIs or application widgets. So I'm not sure if this is part of the requirements for the provider. I wouldn't know how to do it anyway.
So I guess to give I added on some examples there because I think that might be unclear the way it was currently written. So the example would be if one of the requirements up at the development level is to create a UI that allows filtering or extended data, then if you can't get that information from the provider, then it's hard to support that at the developer level.
Oh, sure, yes. But I think application widget is something quite specific.
Lynette, can I ask a question here?
Sure.
As a non-provider, are you thinking of things like creating a reconciliation service for OpenRefine as falling into the category of an application widget for this purpose, for the purpose of this user story?
I would think that if that's one of the things that we want to provide, then that's a question of like, how would the UI API have to, what would the API have to do to support something like that?
Okay, cool.
So I don't think we specifically said OpenRefine
No.
compatibility up in any of the user stories above, but that would be an example of an application widget and what kind of information does it need in order to do that.
Okay.
I'm wondering if the disconnect here is that it says application widgets, and so it wouldn't be application widgets created at the provider level. It would be providing enough data for the application to be able to create application widgets.
I'm wondering how that is different from the first two.
Yes, as far as I see it, it's delivering enough information and enough information to filter probably your results rather than allowing widgets to be used.
So in this case, I'm not the provider to develop some widget, but is someone who use my data, is correct?
Yes, so the idea here is that the next level up with the developers, they are going to want to create widgets like a selection box or a type ahead or some other kind of UI interface that allows a user to actually make a selection, and they need enough data to be able to do that. So
yeah, but also enough data, but also probably some APIs to create some
functionality
widgets.
to allow filtering. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I do, because I do think filtering is an interesting use case because it is a little different. You want to be able to pass in information probably to the provider to say, I want to filter on this particular field or this particular piece of metadata, or, you know, if the provider in their indexing scheme has facets, being able to connect into those facets would also be a valuable thing for the developers to be able to do.
Exactly, yes.
And that might be one of the things that as we move on, you know, we've already had this idea proposed that there might be multiple APIs, not a single API. And how does the user select the correct one? And having a user story like this sort of implies that there might be a need for multiple APIs. So sort of teasing that out as we get further in the process would be a good thing, a good outcome to have. I wonder if along those lines, there would be a good user story that says something like, as a provider, I want to understand how my data is being used.
Yeah. And when you speak about how, you mean also, for example, under which kind of license, or something like, or something different? Because probably as a provider, I want also know if you use my data for a commercial scope, or for free, or to increase your data, and so on.
Can I just ask a question? So not every, not everyone is going to want to know how their data is being used. So I think from the National Library of Medicine's perspective, if you want to access our data, that's great. We don't care how you do it or how you take it because it's free.
So would you care, so I was thinking of this in terms of like, what kinds of things people want to do with the data. So like, do they want to filter it? Do they want to use facets? Because that might change how you want to present your data. If you feel like, you know, your data isn't being used as much as you would like, it might be because it's not being given to the user in a way that's useful to them.
So I'm not really sure that the people who make our data available publicly, I think the idea is that you can access our data however you can access it, and that's going to be the way it is. Like I don't think that the people who create the service for our cataloging data, or our I'm sorry, I've lost the word. But I don't think that they particularly care how you access it, just that this is the way we make available, do what you will with it.
Sure, I think that's one approach. And so I think when you rate these, that might rate very low for you, this particular user story. And for someone else, it might rate a little higher. Does that seem reasonable? So I kind of like to keep it in just so people have an option to sort of rate it to see where it falls.
That's fine. I just want to make it understood that for some people it might not matter.
Yeah, and I imagine for some people it might even be a limit of resources, and they just don't have the time or ability to do all the things that might be listed here. So some of it's going to be aspirational, and I think by going through the process of defining them and then prioritizing them, if you were going to choose between two things and having limited resources, something that was rated higher in the priorities, you might choose to do that as the next thing that you do with your limited resources.
And build on that a little bit.
Sure.
As a consumer or a person trying to evaluate an external vocabulary, it's one of the blind spots I've had is who's using the data, who else is using the data. Sometimes as a consumer of an external data set, it's useful to know, has anybody else felt comfortable enough using this? And it can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy or whatever, but as a consumer, it might be useful to see this to see that information too.
Yeah, I think I want to second what Stephen's saying. Lynette, can you tell us the results of the surveys? I know that they'll go to inform our work, but are we, I guess, in what form are we planning to share out what we learned from like the surveys directly for prioritizing these as these use cases? Because I think that Nancy's point is a good one, that or the point generally being made here is that there are some that are aspirational that people might support in principle, but may not matter for a given institution based on the resources they have. And that seems like sort of a granular piece of information that's maybe not captured in, or we don't have to capture them in the surveys, but it might be really interesting to share out.
Yes. I'm not exactly sure how I would capture that information. So I am just going to point out that the first answer to your first part of that question is that the surveys are going to be put into the wiki. So I've got a placeholder for the cataloger user stories survey, and I'll put in ones for the other surveys as well, and summarize what goes in there. The way the surveys are ending up is that there'll be 5 boxes from extremely important down to not important at all, and they can sort the user stories into those boxes, into those 5 boxes, and there's a limit that you can only put 5 in a box to sort of force people to make some judgment calls, so that you don't end up with everything is like I must have it. But I don't really capture the sense of whether or not it's something that would be hard to do or easy to do.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to answer this question right now, but I guess I'm just putting it forward as something that we might want to ask an open-ended question about elsewhere in the survey, maybe not as part of the sorting exercise.
Yes, there are definitely 2 open-ended questions that are at the end of the survey. One is, are there any use cases that we didn't include that you would like to see included? And the other is there any other information you would like to convey to us? And so there are the 2 open-ended questions at the end. So hopefully that does provide some space for them to be able to make some comments. All right. I was trying to put some examples here that didn't just like repeat what are seen in some of the other areas.
I still don't connect very well to this with this question, with this point, because linked data is basically open to the world, and if I need to understand for every customer how they use my data, that sounds like almost impossible, especially in our field, the ISNI database. We have not only library information, but also music and performances and well, any public figure in the creative world is represented in principle. So I would rather have in our own company processes in place that analyze the way that the our APIs are being used. So if no one ever uses a specific filter or a certain search, a certain query format, then maybe we can discard it, and we should always allow somehow people to ask us to elaborate on what we offer, but that is not part of the what we offer as a provider of the data. I agree with Nancy there that the data is as it is, and people can use it in the way that we have provided. And if things should be different, that should follow a complete other path.
Sure. I think that makes sense. I did add in here as an example, analytics on API usage. And I added in, I want to understand how my data is being used in order to better support access. Because I think that better to support access is sort of the critical piece for me on this, is like, as a developer, I often want to know, how are my users trying to use what I've put out there, and is it working for them?
That is important, yes.
So I don't necessarily want to know the itty bitty details about how they're using it, but just that sort of broad level, how they're using it and whether or not it's working. And if it's not working, then I would want to dig in a little more and find out, why is it not working? Is there something I can do that would shift that? And analytics on API usage certainly gives you an insight into what may not be working if something's not being used at all. But it doesn't necessarily tell you why, because it could be that they're not using it because it was super slow and that they like the API fine, but they can't get the data back fast enough, and so they're abandoning it for that reason. So that's the challenge of analytics, is it doesn't always tell you the why.
That's true, yes.
Also for me, in specifying that even open data can be used under different licenses, but in any case, I think that the important piece of the phrase is to better support access, because if I know how you are using my data, probably I can give you some advice, some suggestion about how you can better use my data for your scope with some additional instruments and so on.
Yeah, I definitely think this is kind of a critical piece for linked data, or at least linked data at the scale that we're doing it, because scalability is a huge aspect of what we deal with. And that's sort of why I brought up the idea that somebody might not be using an API because it's slow. And so there's two questions there really, is it not being used because it's not returning data that's useful, or is it not being used because it's slow? And then there's this additional piece that you're bringing in of how, perhaps I have some expertise that can help guide people towards using the right API, and how do you convey that to them? And I think that kind of comes back to that documentation piece. All right. If there aren't other comments, I think I'm going to go on to the next piece. I don't want to push ahead if folks have more comments to make, but. Okay. As a provider, I want our API to be performant. And I gave the example of sub-second queries. I do think that's somewhat going to be dependent on the data, but I think that's a very good aspirational goal, to always be sub-second queries.
Mm-hmm. This, for example, means that it could be better to create, for example, 10 different APIs, small APIs, instead of one big API that retrieve all together. Is this the sense, one sense of this user story?
So I added on to that this may lead to multiple APIs that are specialized or return different levels or quantities of data. I'm thinking there that there was an example earlier where the data comes back as either a simple list, or maybe it comes back with extended data, or maybe it comes back with a lot of data. And it's possible that one approach is, instead of having one API that can serve all three of those levels in one API, you might end up with multiple APIs. But I like to use the term "this may lead," just because that may vary between the providers how they approach solving that kind of problem. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, for me.
Any adjustment to the wording on that?
No.
Okay, as a provider, I want access to our data to be available 24/7 with occasional outages for maintenance that will be announced in advance.
That seems to me like not so much a provider need, but a user need.
Yes, exactly. Also for me.
I definitely think it's a user need. I guess the question would be, is it aspirational for providers to be able to do that? I mean, I sort of, some of this is like the I want my data to be used, I want my data to be available kind of thing. It's
Okay, so in this case, yes, it's also important for provider. Is the same topic of mapping exigencies. So, okay, is
I guess
important.
yeah, part of the reason why I would put it under a provider is that it definitely has technical implications. If that is something you desire for your data to have that level of availability, then there are definitely technical decisions that would come into play on the provider level to accomplish that.
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
Okay,
Where-
makes sense.
May I ask where you're intending that the maintenance will be announced in advance? Just out of curiosity.
I think that is something that usually we already do. For example, when we need to stop and restart the server for some special works, we need in advance to announce to possible potential users. So be careful, pay attention, because at this time my data will be not available for your usage. So usually we do this. Okay, dear customer, we need to stop our server, so to stop to give you access to our data from 2. I think that this is the sense of this user story. But Lynette, please, I let you confirm or not.
Yes, that's definitely that. I mean, we do that for many of the services that we provide. We have some mechanism that we use to communicate with our end users. And if we're going to have to bring our system down for some reason, and by system, this is all the way from like an end application down to data services at the bottom. And we just generally, we have communication channels with which we've already allowed people to subscribe so that they can get announcements like this. And
So
go ahead.
I guess what I'm wondering, so at NLM, when mesh goes down, or is going to be down, we let NLM know. But I guess what I'm wondering is, who are you expecting us to let know?
Yes, so I think that anyone who uses your data would be interested in that information. Because if someone's connecting directly to NLM and then NLM goes down, if the mesh services go down, then they don't have access to that. And sometimes people are depending on that access. And I think that different providers can handle that differently, because you can have a site that people can go look at, or you can have a subscription type email announcement. So I think there are multiple ways to handle that.
Okay.
There are multiple ways, yes. But for the data that we provide, if we provide it with linked open access, there's no way that you can use you can know who your users are. And the only thing that you can do is basically announce maintenance on your website.
Right. Yeah, I think it is going to vary on the type of data that you have, how much you can do. So like for questioning authority, we have a Slack channel where I would announce if I knew for sure something was going down. I mean, sometimes things just go down on their own and there's nothing you can do about that. But if it's like scheduled maintenance, then the idea is that you would let people know it's coming, just so they can plan.
If you know your customers, yes.
Yes, but if it's on your website, at least that's something.
Yes.
All right. As a provider, I want to provide data for download, facilitating local caching.
Yes, makes sense for me.
Could we talk a bit about what that would entail? I'm not sure what that would mean for Wikidata, for example.
Yeah, I would definitely see where that would be more challenging for Wikidata, since your scope is much broader. Like for a lot, the data, the surrounding collection of data is a little more known in advance, whereas yours changes constantly and the shape of it changes constantly. So I could see where that would be challenging.
But probably in this case, we can add something like a full download or a selected download, because of, for example, I don't know if I'm wrong, but in Wikidata, I can download a filtered section of the whole data set. Is correct?
Yes, you can get a full dump, and there are some tools that allow you to create smaller filtered dumps. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Actually, we're struggling with this question of what to allow people to download at ISNI. And I wonder, for instance, for Wikidata, how is your business case for allowing people to download all your Wikidata? How do you earn money?
How do we earn money? Donations and companies who use our data, understanding that they need to support the project.
But the donations usually go for the online version of Wikidata, don't they? Do you ask for donations for the download as well?
No, there's just general donations to Wikimedia or to one of the organizations in Wikimedia that then gets repurposed for all kinds of stuff, including infrastructure.
So I did add on to this that some considerations impacting what can be downloaded include privacy of data, quantity of data. Is there something else that would impact whether or not data can be downloaded?
I'm not sure can, but should. So for example, for Wikidata, we tell people that if they have high frequency requests that they would send to us, then they are probably better off setting up their local system and use a dump to fill that local system instead of constantly asking our API.
This is more from the consumer side, but being able to filter on things that have been changed, or maybe this will come up elsewhere, but I can imagine only wanting to download things that I haven't downloaded since things changed.
That is definitely, yeah, that is definitely coming up.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about changing, let's see, some considerations impacting whether to download and what can be downloaded include privacy of the data, quantity of data, and frequency of access. All right. So sort of moving from this local caching concept, as a provider, excuse me, I want to keep download files up to date and need to define and publish expectations of reasonably up to date. So some places will make downloads available quarterly, monthly, weekly, or daily. And I think that the definition of what is reasonable will potentially, change depending from authority to authority. I think the most important piece is not necessarily exactly what the periodic timetable is, as much as that there's one defined and users know what to expect and it's meeting the needs. Some data doesn't change very often, and quarterly may be just fine, whereas other data may change rapidly, and so having a shorter window is more important.
So maybe then the user story should include something like publishing on a regular schedule or predictable schedule.
But in this case, we are speaking about something that is the provider, that is decided by the provider, or we are also speaking about a mechanism to retrieve, to download the data in real time when I'm a user and I need. So I just cache your data right now.
I definitely think that that different providers might select a different way of approaching this.
Mm.
And so I did put in there, sorry, let me finish typing and then I'll express my thoughts.
Yes, sorry.
A predictable schedule, and then, for example, quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily, and defining the schedule will depend on aspects of usage and frequency of data changes. So the example you were giving of doing it immediately upon change, I think would be if something's changing really frequently. I know there are going to be some technical challenges trying to do it every time the data changes.
Mm.
I'm going to go ahead and we can come back to this, but I want to go ahead and jump to the next one because I think it has implications. So actually not the next one, I want to do this one. I want to provide notifications of changes to data with examples being something's new, deleted, deprecated, moved, split, merged.
Yeah.
And this is really the change management type piece. And some folks, I have seen it done where some do a feed, and so this is like a steady feed that you could subscribe to, and then you would get changes as soon as they happen. Others do it as a file that when you get a new download file, it's in that, accompanying that is a list of what's changed since the last download was available. So there's different ways to approach that. But that, I think that sort of picks up on having some implications for the previous piece. As done the one, right, this one does as well though, but as a provider, I want to be able to provide partial downloads with only modifications since the last download update.
Yeah, the delta.
Any thoughts or comments on that? Change modification is something that I've had a lot of discussions with folks about as being really important, but not something that is just commonly done. That I think people kind of come to it later in the process, and when they realize that there's more of a need for that when they're doing downloads.
We use the URI register. That means that when something changes in our data, we report the kind of changing and why and when and who changed the data. So probably this is exactly in order to give this kind of information. This entity changed because was split in two or were merged in one, and when this happened and which kind of changing produced in the URIs. So in my opinion, and for us, this is important to give to consumer of our data.
So you mentioned that as doing it as a register. Is this something that's queryable with its own API?
Yeah, yes, because it will be published in RDF with specific URI APIs. So it's something that is available in parallel with our data to better consume our data. Yeah.
I'm curious, from some of the other providers, have you addressed this topic?
So we do we do provide the changes that we're going to make to mesh, and we make the changes then. But I think that we do it in, as you mentioned here, as in a single file.
So I just looked up and saw that it is 1 o'clock. So we actually made it all through except for this very last piece, which has some discussion stuff on there already. So I think we will stop here, and hopefully between now and the next time we meet, I will have already sent out the survey for at least the catalogers, and we'll have perhaps some data to look at. And I think it's really great. We've made it through almost all the user stories. And so I want to thank everybody for participating today and being part of the process.